But if there is an incentive in the future that there's going to be more regulation down the road to prevent them from exploring those, they're not going to invest the money in that.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Yaffee is back. Yaffee's back on the program. So let's go ahead and get started. Yaffee, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
I'm not hearing him, Adam. Can you make sure that do the turn monitor off and then on again, maybe, on the Zoom.
Gotcha.
That's what I did to the other thing.
I can hear you guys. Can you hear
Hey,
me?
there you are.
I hear you. We're in business now.
Yeah, we're in business now.
All right.
Yeah, we're not, not professionals, so occasionally we'll have some technical difficulties. We appreciate your time, though. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Glad to be here.
Yep. Yeah, so before we get into the thing, I wanted to talk to you about inflation because you said some stuff about inflation that I wanted to get some clarification on your program. But before we get to that, can you tell us, this is your third time on the show now, have I ever bitten you or injured you in any way?
No, I don't think so.
No, I don't. I didn't think so either. I feel like I engage in a respectful way. Wouldn't you think that, generally speaking? I mean, I think I can make jokes and stuff, but I think I'm generally pretty easy to talk to.
Yeah. On the show. It's just, you can be vicious on Twitter, but that's normal.
That is very true. This is Adam chiming in to say yes. I observed that as well. But yeah, on the show, I will say that we always try to have constructive dialogue with people. We've had people that disagree with us, and we try to model good conversations, good dialogue. And Yaffee, I will say that every time you've been on this program, as much as we may disagree, you've always been very respectful and cool to talk to. And so, I mean, I think that's a good thing that we're able to have respectful dialogue across pretty extreme political differences.
Yeah.
I do think, in my defense on Twitter, I think most of the time it's a pretty tongue-in-cheek. I don't think I would give off the air that I'm genuinely being hateful unless something really pisses me off.
Well, most people on Twitter are pretty mean, so it's
and you match the medium, right? You match the medium. Everybody.
I was about to say, when in Rome, Yeah,
right. Yeah, and so one time I actually tweeted something that was totally a joke. I said something about, I was in somebody's article, and I won't name them because I don't want to embarrass them, but I was in somebody's article, and there were a bunch of other people in this person's article, and they tagged them on Twitter, but they didn't tag me, and it was just because, they ran out of room. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. But I replied, and I said, censored again, or something like that, And this dude calls me, and he's like, "Why are you trying to cause trouble for me, man? That's my employer that you're tweeting at right there." And I'm like, Jesus Christ, man. Calm down. It's a tweet. Chill out. So I think people can take Twitter a bit too seriously. But yeah, so I asked that because I have asked Phil Williams to come on the show. And he has engaged with me on Twitter. But he's not replying to any of my emails. And same thing with Brian Dawson from 1819 News, because I was interested in talking to Brian Dawson from 1819 News because he gave a total fluff interview to Dean Odle, the flat earth pro-military coup gubernatorial candidate, and talked to him like he was a real like a real viable candidate who had real ideas and stuff like that, and wasn't just a kook. Which, to the credit of the people on WVNN, at least y'all just laughed him off the radio if you had him on at all. But Dale had him on, and Dean Odle will not come on again. And that's appropriate. That's what you do when a flat earther runs for governor, I think. If you platform them at all, you just laugh at them. But they had this guy on, and they didn't even mention that he thinks we need a military coup. Which is on his campaign website. He said that on his campaign website for governor of Alabama, he's like, the only way that we can get a free society again is for the military to take over and to like execute Joe Biden or something. And he also
I did
has
not know that. I'll have to go look at that.
Yes, it's crazy. And that he's flat. His flat Earth stuff is all out there. They didn't mention any of that stuff. Like, they just talked to him about, like, normal things. Like, this is a normal person. And so I wanted to talk to him about that because 1819 News, they want to kind of portray themselves as like, oh, we just give you the straight dope, and that was pretty interesting to me. So, all right, well, I appreciate the vote of confidence. The inflation stuff, you said, can you just explain to me why you think we have inflation right now?
Well, it's a multifaceted thing. Obviously, the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates artificially low for a long time. And so that's going to increase the money supply. They have increased the money supply. But there is no doubt in the past 2 years under COVID, under Republicans and Democrats, they have completely blown out the spending. While at the same time, there has been supply chain issues and less productivity in the market. So you have just throwing a bunch of cash everywhere. People have too much cash, but on the supply side is less. And you also have deficits, the debt, and the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates artificially low for so long. It was a recipe for the kind of inflation we're seeing. And they said a lot of it was transitory because they thought it was solely just supply chain issues, which ended up being wrong. I think a lot of this was entirely predictable.
Mm-hmm. And so what is the prescription to address that?
Well, the Federal Reserve did raise interest rates. They're going to have to do that. So that is part of it. It's not going to be a one-time solution. I have been arguing for a supply side solution as well, where we deregulate, add some deregulation, possible tax rate cuts, and opening the energy sector so we can get, we want a strong dollar. So the Federal Reserve is going to try to do that, hopefully. I don't know if they're going to be strong enough. That's part of it. We also need spending cuts, control of spending in D.C. That's going to be part of it. But we also need to get the supply side moving, and anything we can do to encourage more productivity on the supply side so they can actually keep up with the demand, since there's higher demand, I think will help as well.
Yeah, so let the deregulation, tax cuts, and then there was a third thing?
Cutting spending, strong dollar.
Spending.
Yeah.
So the deregulation, how would, what are the regulations that are standing in the way of producers right now, you think?
Well, when you talk about the energy market, there's definitely some regulations standing in the way, preventing. And, this is something that they wanted because they wanted to switch us to more green energy. So they have talked about they don't want to open up as many leases before. They don't want to have the Keystone XL pipeline. They don't want, and a lot of these things are done on the state level. There's other pipelines in state levels that have been blocked. Things have been held up in court. Any way we can kind of increase the productivity there so we can produce more energy here at home, I think will help. In terms of farming, I know there are some sugar regulations that encourage less producing of sugar. A lot of this is left over from the Great Depression because they wanted to keep prices high for sugar. Well, we need to find out ways to deregulate that so we can get more. I mean, right now, if we're going to have a food shortage, we need to figure out what regulations could get in the way of farmers producing more food. Those are just a couple examples, I think.
But I think generally you kind of gestured to different areas of the economy and said we need to deregulate, but I'm not sure that And just say it again if I missed it, but I'm not sure that I actually heard like a thing, like an actual thing that is standing in the way of producers producing.
Well, in terms of we need to open up leases on energy production. Yes,
we need to open up leases on energy production, and that's the regulation that you think that we need.
One of them, and we need to approve. We definitely need to approve the Keystone XL pipeline, I think.
Jacob, I don't want to steal your thunder here, but I'm just going to say that I'm not sure how any of that necessarily means lower prices. If inflation is about the rise of prices, I don't see how any of that addresses the fact that ultimately companies can charge whatever they want as far as the market will bear. And given that we're so dependent on oil as one example, but also the meat industry and other industries where we've seen record profits, we've seen where they are price gouging. And ultimately, I'm not seeing, and even from Democrats as well, I'm not seeing any proposals that actually addresses rising prices, because changing the interest rates doesn't necessarily do that. It does historically cause recessions. Deregulation. We could I think there's opportunities to open up more oil extraction. Of course, that brings us closer to the apocalypse. But even separate from that, it does take time for that supply to actually hit the marketplace. But it still doesn't. There's no price controls. There's no alternatives to the consumption, right? So, I mean, if we're basically backs against the wall, the prices of essential goods and services continue to skyrocket quicker than wages, but we don't have the alternative of consuming less necessarily, or consuming different alternatives. We don't have anything that's proposing price controls. We, are still unable to actually address some of the supply chain issues that are coming from COVID, because China has determined they don't want to see 1 million of their people die from this virus, and so they are taking some, pretty extreme measures. We could argue about whether it's worth it or not, but regardless, there are supply chain issues as a result of COVID and COVID measures. So all these things are factoring together. But at the end of the day, we can hear in these board of director meetings that these companies recognize they can raise their prices, they can charge us more, and there's really nothing we can do about it. And giving them more money through tax cuts or deregulations, I don't see how that gives them any incentive to tamp down on runaway price inflation. In fact, I think it would probably do the opposite. So what I'm hearing, just as a regular, not an economist, just a rank and file Alabama worker, I'm not hearing anyone in the political establishment tell me anything that's actually going to address inflation in terms of me paying more at the gas pump and me paying more at the grocery store. I'm not hearing it. And what I'm seeing, though, from what you just mentioned is basically more of the same Reaganomics that we've been doing for 40 years. And what I'm hearing from the Fed is, we're going to restrict the money supply by raising interest rates, which, like 7 out of 8 times it did cause a recession, but just trust us, this time we've got it under control. And I've seen a lot of blame on wages. I've seen labor being blamed as if we're somehow part of the cause here, even though the wage increases that we're seeing across the board are not even keeping up with inflation. So I don't know. I'm not an economist, as I said, so some of this is frankly over my head. But I'm still not hearing anything from anybody that explains to me how prices are going to be reined in, how we will rein in the power of corporate America to charge us whatever the hell they want, and I don't think even more fossil fuel extraction, destroying our natural habitat, ruining our national parks and federal lands, to pump more carbon in our atmosphere that brings us closer to literal civilization extinction level events. None of this seems like the answer to me. But that's my soapbox, and I'll get off of it and turn it back over to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, what do what is, because I think that's a lot of, because I don't know, I have some kind of general ideas, but I'm not the inflation thing is a bit over my head as well, but that is kind of the general critique that I have, because it seems to me that the idea coming from the right is that inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods, and tax cuts are a stimulative policy, right? They're a stimulative policy. They don't stimulate very much, but it is a stimulative policy. Deregulation is, it seems to me that the idea of deregulation is that you free up more resources for them to produce more, but they have so much in profits that I'm not understanding how
they're incentivized to produce more?
A 1% cost decrease because of a deregulation, a decrease in regulations is going to actually increase their production, and so it's difficult for me to kind of wrap my head around.
Yeah, well, I mean, economics is always based on incentives, and when by freeing up, I think the supply side, like I said, especially with deregulation, it adds those incentives to produce more, I think. And you're saying, well, they're not going to really want to produce more because they're already having record profits, so they're just gouging customers. Not really sure I buy that, but anytime you free up the private sector, you can talk about the big corporations. They're the ones, yeah, you're right, that they are not hurt as much by inflation. But when you free up the entire private sector, you can add more competition. And it's really competition, small businesses, other producers out there that are going to help them more accountable, make them more accountable. And anything we can do to increase not only competition, but just incentives, because it is their business to want to sell goods and services. And eventually, they're not going to be able to just keep having high prices. The market's going to change. So they're not just thinking about now, but they're also going to think about the future. And I don't think it's in their future economic interest to just keep prices high and price a lot of people out of the market. They're going to want to find ways to get more of their product to customers. And I think anything we can do on the regulation side to help speed up that process, I think is a good thing based on incentives. Any ways we can incentivize them to do that is a good thing. And I'm not really a big fan of going down the price control route because that seems to have perverse incentives, I think. And especially...
No, yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. That was basically my main point.
Jacob, real quick, I just wanted to say something that I heard that I think we probably agree on is the monopoly. Because, Yaffee, I agree with you that the large private sector industries, your Amazons, your Walmarts, BP Oil, these companies are not facing the same kind of economy that small to mid-sized businesses face. So while we disagree on much there is something to that. And I think that's where, I'm coming from and is that part of the reason we have an inflation crisis right now, it's not so much about, government spending or regulations. It's about the growth of monopoly power, where so much of our economy is concentrated into just a handful of corporations. When you have Tyson dominating the meat industry and you have Amazon and Walmart dominating their industries, they have a power that is unchecked. And, so I know price controls is something that's been done in the past. I agree that it has its downfalls because ultimately you can start to see capital go on strike. Capital has its own class consciousness, oftentimes more so than us working class people, and they're certainly willing to organize and refuse to invest. The last few decades, there's been a lot of that where money is not being reinvested into production. It's just going into fake economies, whether that's stock market speculation, crypto, NFTs, Silicon Valley companies that really never profit but somehow have, massive stock volumes. So, again, the monopoly power is a key here when we're talking about inflation. And the Fed is not up to the task of checking monopoly power. I would argue that the Reaganomics that you're discussing is not up to the task of dealing with monopoly power. If anything, I think that led us to where we're at with that. That's what I'm thinking.
On the oil stuff, aren't there? And I know that there's a conservative rebuttal, and you're not to this, and you're not supposed to ask questions you don't know the answer to. But I can't recall it. I recall not being satisfied. But isn't there something like 9,000 oil leases that are not being used right now, and oil companies are seeing record profit? Why is there not an incentive to use the leases that they have right now, or to increase production in the places that they're already at, as opposed to just giving shareholders more money?
Yeah, and that was something that the Biden administration had said. There are some leases right now. Now, I will say some of those leases had been held up in court for environmental reasons, which is a whole nother subject. But in terms of, there are some that they are using. But if there is an incentive in the future that there's going to be more regulation down the road to prevent them from exploring those, they're not going to invest the money in that. So there has to be a complete economic policy in terms of, we're going to allow you to explore as much as possible. And they're going to want to invest their money to do that. Now, you're right, there was another reason for that, and I can't recall it either specifically on the oil leases. But it had something to do with, I believe it had something to do with it being held up in certain other areas.
It just seems to me. It just seems to me that.
Basically, what you're saying is that the oil companies are loving this. They're price gouging. They don't want to explore
there's
more.
one. ConocoPhillips had a profit increase of 1,400%, 1,400%. So they could, with that much increased profits, they could have gas maybe 5 cents a gallon less than all their other competitors, and it seems like that would be an incentive that would be there, but instead they just have those profits instead. Well,
and I'm sorry, but as someone who is aware that climate change is putting us down a path of existential threat, I don't think we need to do anything to incentivize more drilling and more extraction, because that means more death and more chaos. And I know that's not a popular thing to say, because right now we're all feeling the pinch at the gas pump. But, in my view, I don't see why the oil industry even has a right to exist. It is a national security threat. What they are doing, the carbon that is being pumped into our atmosphere, is a security threat, not just for the United States of America, but for literally every human on this planet, all living species on this planet. The science is very, very clear about that. So, while price controls, maybe that's not the most ideal option, but hell, what if we actually nationalized the energy sector so that we could do what we have to do in this transitional phase to make sure folks have the fuel they need for the economy to be going in the right direction. But we absolutely do need green energy not now, like years ago, like yesterday. And so, I know we're getting kind of deep on the oil factor, because it's not just oil. Prices are rising everywhere, and it's not just due to fossil fuel cost. I mean, the meat industry is a great example where monopoly power has an ability to, jack up the prices, and what are we going to do about it? So that's really what bothers me, is I don't see any program from any direction really that it's explaining how we rein in these prices. And this is where we're going to disagree. I just am never going to accept that more drilling and more destruction of our environment for the temporary, use of fossil fuels is going to be worth it in the long run. Because I feel like our grandchildren and their children are going to look back and wonder what in the hell we were doing.
One thing I will say is it does seem like you admit that there are incentives out there to prevent more fossil fuel exploration.
Not enough, frankly.
Yeah, I think he was just saying his opinion. I think that, I don't think that there's ever been an actual taking back of the ability once it's given. I mean, I don't think that anybody has ever pointed to any well that Biden has shut down or any lease that Biden has shut down. I mean, everything that was open under the Trump administration is open now, or can be open now. And there's some production that just simply isn't happening right now. We still don't have the production levels, not because there are new regulations, but because they're just choosing not to produce, even in America. I mean, right? Isn't that right? Like, are there places that were pumping oil under the Trump administration that aren't anymore?
When you talk about supply and demand, and I have to admit I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there were, when you talk about future leases, those were shut down. And you're right, some of that is because during COVID there was such a glut. It was the opposite. There was so much supply because everyone was at home that they didn't have to do it. So they're going to have to catch up. And I think they will catch up in some ways. But when you have an administration that immediately when they get there and they say, we're not going to offer any new leases, we're going to have a moratorium on those kind of leases, we're going to have a moratorium on pipelines, we're going to have a moratorium on whatever, they're going to be reluctant to invest in any kind of new exploration because they kind of see the writing on the wall. And in that way, it kind of just incentivizes them to say, okay, we're just going to take our profits and right now and just raise prices. And I would rather have some kind of incentive that at least gets some of them to say, okay, we need to look at this future exploration because we need to get the supply up, because that's the main way you lower prices is you have more and more supply. And
but, I mean, that's like a long-term fix, and if because that's not gonna there's nothing that's gonna fix the thing short term. And so if you're talking long-term solutions, I'm talking long-term solutions. I think both of us are amicable to like nuclear energy. Why would we not be doing something like that, which is going to be less of a or not a driver of climate change and actually provides cheaper electricity than gas or oil? Like, why is it that we want to incentivize more exploration instead of incentivizing more nuclear energy or wind and solar?
Well, if you want to talk about nuclear energy, I'm with you 100%. I mean, if we can find ways to incentivize more nuclear energy, because you're right, there are zero emissions with that. I mean, you want to talk about clean energy, you could have possibly other ramifications in terms of nuclear waste that we could talk about. I think a lot of that, the dangers of that has been exaggerated. I think a lot of the so-called dangers of a meltdown have really been exaggerated. It can be made in a much safer way. I would love for us to go towards more nuclear energy. And if that's part of the policy prescription, I'm on board. But I haven't seen that either. And in terms of short-term and long-term, a lot of times when you immediately open up supply, yes, it's a long-term thing, but it's also short-term. It's also going to be priced in now because when you look at prices, they're going to see future supply coming on, and that's going to be put in their decision when it's traded on the open market.
Well, I'm going to throw something out here that we've not addressed, which is foreign policy, which plays a big role here. We have countries such as Venezuela and Iran that are oil-producing countries, which have been subject to very harsh sanctions regimes. Those could be negotiated out, right? Those could be ended. Those could be new producers available for the marketplace. We had an Iran nuclear deal that was ripped up by the previous president, and Venezuela, I've heard some, talk that maybe there's going to be some thawing of relations with Venezuela due to this energy crisis. And the other piece of it, of course, is we have a proxy war with Russia happening in Europe, and that's obviously having a major impact on prices across the board, but specifically with oil and gas. And there's nothing, it's not like written in the Bible that we have to have these sanctions.
Right.
It's not, it's very possible that the United States, as the largest economy, as the most powerful country on earth, the most wealthy country on earth, could actually use its power and influence to try to negotiate peace and diplomacy. But it appears that that's not really on the table. And I think that's a failure of the White House and a failure of NATO. Of course, that's not to deflect blame from Putin and the Russian invasion. They have committed an illegal invasion, an illegal war. And so it's not that, we should be okay with that. But the United States response to try to strangle Russia and the Russian economy absolutely is having an impact on inflation and on the fuel supply. And the United States response to funnel tens of billions of dollars in weapons that are going to be largely unaccounted for over into Eastern Europe really is poised to prolong this conflict. And it's a shame. It's a shame because when we have wars like this, it's ordinary, regular people, men, women, and children who bear the brunt of it, while politicians and generals can comfortably make these decisions, and while the military-industrial complex can profit in an obscene manner off this death and destruction. So, that's kind of the elephant in the room, I think, is that there's a foreign policy regime here of American imperialism which is undergirding all of this.
Well, when you talk about, there are many different aspects. If we open up to Iran, what does that mean for Iran's military power? That's what they're going to use the money for. But also, they're in direct
they'll never have
with
the military we have.
True.
I'm not personally. If Iran spends more on the military, that doesn't bother me. They have a right to have a military to the extent that any government has the right to exist. Why wouldn't they spend money on their military given the way they've been treated? We overthrew their government in 1953, a democratic government. The CIA and MI6 came in. They overthrew that government and installed a dictator who reigned with a bloody fist for over 2 decades there, with secret police trained by the CIA. And it's no surprise that ultimately it backfired in our face with the Islamic Revolution in '79. But, in all these situations where we name these countries that are supposedly bad guys, that are supposed to be our enemies, it's worth digging deeper to see, well, why do they have a problem with America? Is it just because, they don't like the way we talk, they don't like the way we look, they don't like our flags and our freedom, and, that's the surface level sort of response we have. But then you dig a little deeper and realize, you know what, if someone overthrew my government, I'd feel some type of way about that. That's just me. But, so I'm not personally, and I'm sorry to cut you off. I just get really, fired up about this in particular, because I don't have a problem with the Iranian people. And the Iranian government sucks, as do most governments, and it has its blood on its hands. But Iran is an oil-producing country. There's nothing that, on a practical matter, stops us as a country from negotiating with Iran to end these sanctions, to bring them back into the marketplace beyond our fears that, yes, their power and influence would grow in the Middle East. And, that's something that evidently the United States is unwilling to do, is unwilling to see any sort of alternatives or any other powers grow around the world, even halfway across the world.
Yeah, and you could talk about our dependence on foreign oil in general. You could talk about foreign policy. You could talk about, the Russian war has definitely caused an increase of prices. And, if we just don't give the Ukrainians a military aid, well, then basically there's a chance that the Russians are just going to win. And are we willing to accept something like that in Europe? That is all a deep discussion we could definitely have. But overall, I think then if we're talking once again about finding ways to increase supply, I think the better solution would be find ways to increase energy supply here. And I will say Jacob made a good point that, it should not just be focused on oil. It should be focused on natural gas. It should be focused on nuclear energy. But there are times where there are strict environmentalist groups who fight very hard against both natural gas and nuclear energy, which have far fewer carbon emissions than coal and oil. So I would much rather open it up as much as we can here in the U.S. so we're not having to be dependent on supplies from foreign countries.
Yeah,
I mean, it's oil's always traded on a world market, so I'm not one who likes to use the word energy independent, because the fact is the world market will affect it. But if we can have supply here and increase supply here in different areas, that's going to have a much more impact on the world market than if we free it up in other countries, I think.
But I think in the immediate term, wouldn't the as far as everything that you're talking about, the quickest thing would be to remove sanctions on Venezuela and Iran and begin importing their oil, wouldn't it?
Well, I will say I'm not sure about that, just because Iran is enemies with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is still a major importer of ours. So if we start getting it from Iran, there's a chance Saudi Arabia is going to be very pissed off. And it's these kind of things where that's why it becomes very, very dangerous, where I agree with you guys that being dependent on these foreign countries and foreign policy gets very complicated. And so you could release sanctions on Iran, get it from Iran, get it from Venezuela, but that causes other problems from other countries where we get other goods. So,
and that's fair. That's definitely fair.
And I think I think that France has a really good energy. They're almost 100% of their energy is from nuclear, isn't it?
Yeah, and I agree with that completely. I think we have really dropped the ball, because the amount of energy we could get cheaply and cleanly from nuclear energy far surpasses any other kind of energy. And I would be all in favor of that for many different reasons.
Yeah. I think that would be the, I think that there are some drawbacks, but I think I think I've been more or less convinced that nuclear can be built safely at this point if it's done either with an extreme amount of government oversight or by the government. I don't know that I would trust a company to do it, but
well, there would definitely need to be some regulations involved, and I think there already are. But the regulations have gotten so to the point, a lot of it's on the local level, where people have just been scared to death for different reasons of nuclear energy, that anytime it's brought up, it's just, people are scared of it.
Yeah. So I think my prescription to attack inflation would be to pull money out of the money supply by taxing rich people and giving the money back to working people, and increasing investment in nuclear energy, and removing sanctions. I think that's what we've agreed on. Is that right, Yaffee?
Nice try. That's good.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, this wasn't, and I have much less firm opinions on inflation and what to do about it. So that's why I was spending a lot of time listening, as opposed to normally where I have very strong opinions about things. So I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for inviting me, guys.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.